Most everyone already knows the story of the infamous Titanic sinking, when, on the night of April 14th, during its maiden voyage, the supposedly unsinkable luxury ship hit an iceberg, and then, after almost 3 hours, in the early morning hours of April 15th, the ship sank into the icy water, with over 1,500 people losing their lives, in the most deadly maritime disaster in history. It's safe to say that most learned the events of this story from the 1990s blockbuster film, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. That movie does do a pretty good job of getting the essence of the historical story. Obviously, everyone knows that the love story is false, but overall it does a pretty good job of capturing the event, in the chaos of that deadly night. However, the movie leaves out one of the most controversial elements of the catastrophe. That is the story of the other ship. That ship was named the Californian. It was positioned in the ice fields possibly only 10 miles from the Titanic, in visual range of the doomed vessel. The Californian could have positioned itself to save the lives of the roughly 1,500 souls who perished that night. However, in a cruel twist of fate, the Californian's captain and crew did not act. This is the story of the other ship that night. We'll start with a brief timeline of events of the Titanic disaster. The times of these events are estimates, since it can be pretty hard to be precise with an event that's over 100 years old. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic set sail and began her maiden voyage. The maiden journey is mostly routine for the next 3 days. On April 14th, 1912 is when the story of the disaster starts to unfold. Throughout the day, the Titanic receives a variety of iceberg warnings. The radio operators did not relay all of these messages. At the time, all wireless operators on ocean liners were employees of the Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, and not members of the ship's crew. As such, their primary responsibility was to send messages for the passengers, with weather reports as a secondary concern. At 9 a.m., the Coronia reports ice. Captain Smith acknowledges receipt of this message. At 1:42 p.m., the Baltic reports ice. Captain Smith also acknowledges this report, and even shows it to the White Star Line chairman, Bruce Ismay, aboard the Titanic for her maiden voyage. Smith then orders a new course to be set, to take the ship further south in order to take the Titanic into safer waters away from icebergs. At 1:45 p.m., the America reports ice. This ship was a short distance to the south of the Titanic, when she reported that she had passed 2 large icebergs. This message never reached Captain Smith or the other officers on the Titanic's bridge. At 7:30 p.m., the Californian reports ice. And then at 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba reports ice. This message too never left the Titanic's radio room. The radio operator, Jack Phillips, may have failed to grasp its significance, because he was busy with sending messages for passengers via the relay station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. The radio set had broken down the day before, resulting in a backlog of messages that the 2 operators were trying to clear. At 11 p.m., the Californian warns of ice again, but it is cut off by Jack Phillips before she gives the location of the ice sighting. Evans, the wireless operator on the Californian, had forgotten to get Phillips okay before breaking in on his transmission. Phillips furiously replied to Evans, telling him to shut up, since Phillips was in the middle of working on sending passenger messages. Evans did not reply after. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg dead ahead. The Titanic furiously tries to turn left, or port, so as to avoid the iceberg. However, it is unable to avoid the iceberg, and is struck on the starboard or right side of the bow. The Titanic was capable of floating with any 2 of her 16 watertight compartments flooded. In extreme cases, she could actually float with 4 of her forward compartments flooded. The iceberg exposed a critical design flaw though. The first 2 watertight bulkheads extended only as high as D deck, as did the last 5. However, the middle 8 bulkheads only carried up to E deck. With 6 compartments breached by the impact with the iceberg, the weight of the incoming water would pull the ship's head down, until the water in the flooded compartments rose above the top of the bulkheads. The water in the 5th compartment would spill over into the 6th, pulling the ship down further, until the water in the 6th compartment spilled into the 7th, and so on until the ship inevitably sank. At 11:50 p.m., the lookout in the crow's nest signals that he has spotted another ship off the port side. The ship's signals had only become visible after the Titanic had turned around the iceberg and swung her bow to the north. Fourth Officer Boxhall uses glasses to see the steamship, roughly a third of the size of the Titanic. She appears to be motionless, with her green starboard light showing. Captain Smith will not act on this mystery ship for another 45 minutes. It is now April 15, 1912. At midnight, the captain was told the ship can only stay afloat for a couple more hours. He now gives the order to call for help over the radio. 12:05 a.m. The orders are given to uncover the lifeboats and to get passengers and crew ready on deck. There was only room in the lifeboats for half of the estimated 2,227 souls on board. Captain Smith realizes half the lives on his ship will most likely be lost. 12:25 a.m. The lifeboats begin loading with women and children first. This order by Smith is not elaborated on. Some officers take it to mean women and children only, while others take it to mean women and children first. The Carpathia, southeast of the Titanic by 58 miles, picks up the distress call and begins frantically sailing to rescue the doomed vessel. It will take her roughly 4 hours to reach the Titanic. 12:35 a.m. Captain Smith tells Boxhall to try contacting the mystery ship by Morse lamp code. 12:45 a.m. The first lifeboat was safely lowered away. Although it could carry 65 people, it left with only 28 on board. At this time, Titanic officers also start firing off rockets, letting one go every 5 minutes. 8 rockets in all were fired during the whole night. 1:15 a.m. The officers on the bridge stare out at the mystery ship in the distance. The Titanic has slowly drifted on the current until both green and red lights for the mystery ship are showing. This means the Titanic was facing the ship's bow head on. They are confused why the ship doesn't respond to the rockets. Finally, Boxhall gives up trying to contact the ship by Morse lamp code. 2:05 a.m. The last lifeboat has left the ship. There were now over 1,500 people left on board. The tilt of the Titanic's deck grows steeper and steeper. 12:17 a.m. The last radio message was sent out. The captain announces every man for himself. 2:20 a.m. The Titanic's broken off stern settles back into the water, becoming more level for a few moments. Slowly it fills in with water and tilts its high end into the air before sinking into the sea. People in the water are slowly starting to freeze to death. 3:30 a.m. Carpathia's rockets were spotted by survivors. 4:10 a.m. The first lifeboat was picked up by the Carpathia. 7:30 a.m. The Californian arrives at the Titanic's last known location. 8:50 a.m. The Carpathia leaves the area bound for New York. She has on board 705 survivors of the Titanic disaster. April 18, 1912. The Carpathia arrives in New York. April 19, 1912. The Californian arrives in Boston. The SS Californian was a steamship crossing the Atlantic at the same time as the Titanic, with the ultimate goal of making port in Boston. She was not carrying any passengers on this voyage. On the navigation bridge, she was led by experienced seaman Stanley Lord as captain of the ship, and he was accompanied by 3 officers and an apprentice. George Stewart was second in command or chief officer, Herbert Stone was second officer, Charles Groves was third officer, and the apprentice was James Gibson. On the fateful night of April 14, 1912, at around 10 p.m., the Californian was steaming through the cold night when her third officer, Charles Victor Groves, spotted several white patches in the water dead ahead. He thought the white specks were probably porpoises. However, Captain Lord immediately recognized them to be icebergs. He ordered a full stop, and before long, the ship was surrounded by chunks of floating ice. Lord decided the ice was too dangerous, and that he would rather navigate through the ice field during daylight hours. At 11 p.m., Lord went to the chart room, intending to pass the night stretched out on a couch there. He left specific instructions with Groves to be called if he spotted anything. The night was clear and peaceful. The ship quietly drifted with the current. Her bow swung around until she was pointed almost due east. The sea was stunningly calm, and the visibility was exceptional, with the stars standing out in the night sky. At roughly 11:15 p.m., Groves notices the glare of a ship steaming up over the horizon from the east. She was ablaze with lights from bow to stern. The newcomer vessel passed directly parallel to the starboard side of the motionless Californian. It was guessed to be roughly 10 to 12 miles away. Groves recognizes this to be a large ocean liner, since it was several decks high and shining with lights. At around 11:30 p.m., he went down to the chart room and informed Captain Lord of the passing vessel. However, before Groves came down to inform Captain Lord, Lord had also been watching this new ship. Lord had a much less clear perspective than Groves did, since he was watching from the port window in the chart room, lower than the deck Groves was on. Lord believed the new vessel was similar in size to his own. At roughly 11 p.m., he stepped over to his wireless operator, Cyril Evans, and asked if he knew of any other ships nearby. Evans replied that he only knew of the Titanic being close by. Lord then told Evans to warn the Titanic that the Californian had stopped and was surrounded by ice. After Groves talked with Lord about the new vessel, he was told to try and contact her by Morse lamp. Groves then tried but gave up after a few moments, when he received no reply. Lord then went to the bridge to get a better vantage point of this ship. Meanwhile, Evans, the wireless operator, had already slipped on his headphones, adjusted his set, and tapped out to Jack Phillips on the Titanic. "Say, old man, we are surrounded by ice," and stopped. In this, Evans made a mistake. He had forgotten to ask Phillips for permission to break into the Titanic's traffic. As well, Evans hadn't properly identified himself. At this time was when Phillips was working furiously to catch up on personal messages, and was livid that another radio operator had just barged in on his signal, leading Phillips to type back angrily, shut up, you are jamming me. I am working Cape Race." Annoyed at the brush-off, Evans put down his headphones and shut down his set. Captain Lord had never specified that he wanted acknowledgement from the Titanic, and Evans wasn't about to annoy Phillips again. Anyway, the Titanic had been so close that her powerful transmitter had nearly blown off Evans' ears when Phillips responded. So just a few minutes before 11:30 p.m., Evans puts on his pajamas and settles into his bunk for bed. Now it is roughly 11:40 p.m. Groves notices the big liner suddenly seems to stop and put out most of her lights. This is because at that time, the Titanic had made a sudden and sharp turn to port in order to try and avoid the iceberg. Groves, on the other hand, believes the ship went dark as a signal to passengers to go to bed. Lord, now on the bridge, analyzes the ship through his glasses and remarks that he doesn't believe the other ship is a passenger liner. Groves counters that he is sure, and he even saw the vessel turn out its lights, like passenger liners would do close to midnight. Lord gave a grunt, then announced that he was returning to the chart room. Lord asked to be informed if any other ships are spotted, that mystery vessel changes bearing, or anything else unusual occurs. Now the time is just before midnight. On the Titanic, they are learning the extent of the damage, and the fact that she will remain afloat for only a couple more hours. Meanwhile, on the Californian, the second officer, Herbert Stone, was making his way to the bridge for the midnight to 4 a.m. watch. He stopped by the chart room briefly, where he learned from Captain Lord that their ship was surrounded by ice, and stopped for the night. Lord also mentioned the other vessel off to the southeast that had come up less than an hour ago. That vessel was now showing its masthead light as well as the red port side light. The masthead light usually signifies you were looking at the front of another ship, while the red light was used on the port side of the ship. So that information tells us the Titanic is facing the Californian, with its left side visible at this point. Just before Stone goes up to the bridge, Lord gives him the instruction to inform the captain of any change in bearing by the ship, or if the ship moves closer to the Californian. Stone then relieves Groves, and is joined by the young apprentice officer, James Gibson. Gibson peers down his glasses at the mystery ship. He could clearly make out the masthead light, her red portside light, in the glare of the white lights of the afterdecks. He attempted to contact the ship by Morse lamp, but was no more successful than Groves had been. After a while, he gives up and leaves to attend to the patent log. Groves, on the other hand, after being relieved, went to the wireless office. He had always been fascinated by the device, and was trying to learn how to use it. When he got there, Evans wasn't exactly in a talking mood, after a long day that ended with him getting yelled at by Phillips from the Titanic. Groves asked Evans what ships did he have, and Evans responded, only the Titanic. Groves then picks up the headphones, hoping to pick up some traffic. However, since he was still new to operating the device, he didn't realize the Californian's wireless set was equipped with a magnetic detector driven by clockwork. So when Groves failed to wind up the device, he heard nothing. Disappointed at the emptiness, Groves put down the headphones and went to his cabin. The time was just after 12:15 a.m., and Jack Phillips of the Titanic had just sent out his first distress call. By a cruel twist of fate, the Californian had just missed it. By 12:40 a.m., Gibson was working on the log while Stone paced back and forth across the bridge. Captain Lord then called up from the voice tube from the chart room asking if the strange ship had come any closer. Stone replied no, everything was the same as before. Lord then replied that he was going to go lie down for a bit. Less than 10 minutes later though, a white flash streaked across the cold night sky, above the other ship. Stone was unsure of what he saw, so he watched the strange vessel closely, and after a few minutes was rewarded with another white flash. It was a white rocket being launched by the other ship high above and showering down white stars. Stone watched as 5 rockets were sent up by the Titanic. Stone called down the voice tube for Captain Lord to tell him about the rockets. Lord asked if the rockets were company signals, like how fishing ships use to identify each other. Stone replied that he didn't know, so Lord told him to go send Morse lamp signals, and to let him know if they got an answer. Lord then returned to his nap, and Stone returned to studying the ship. The Californian had slowly drifted throughout the night, turning to the starboard. Her bow gradually came around until bearing directly on the other ship. Around this time, Gibson returned to the bridge, and Stone told him about the rockets. Then another rocket went up, and Gibson used his glasses to take a look. His glasses were more powerful than Stone's, and could make out more details. He noticed a white detonating flash, the rocket streaking in the air, and the spray of slowly falling white stars. Stone felt it was strange that a ship would fire rockets at night. After another, the 7th, rocket went in the air, Stone asked for Gibson's glasses to take a look. After taking a look, he handed them back to Gibson and commented on how the ship looked like it was out of the water and the lights looked weird. Gibson then took a look and noticed the ship appeared to be listing and had a big side out of the water. Stone also noticed the red port side light was gone. The Californian continued her slow drifting turn to starboard until she was now off the port bow. Then at 1:40 a.m., they saw an 8th and final rocket. Stone commented that a ship wouldn't fire a rocket at sea for nothing. Gibson agreed, mentioning that there must be something wrong with her, and she might be in some sort of distress. As the men watched the strange vessel slowly begin to disappear, Stone figured she seemed to be steaming away. Gibson also thought it seemed like the mystery ship was sailing away, but noted that the ship had shown her red portside light, but never her green starboard one, which would have been seen if the ship had indeed been steaming away to the southwest. The time is 2 a.m. Stone sends Gibson down to wake up Captain Lord, telling him to inform the captain that the other ship was steaming away and had fired 8 total rockets. Gibson relayed the message, and Lord asked if all rockets were white. Gibson replied yes. Then Lord asked the time, and Gibson said it was 2:05 a.m. Lord then went back to sleep, and Gibson went back to the bridge. At 2:20 a.m., Stone thought he could still faintly make out the ship, and then her lights completely faded away. At that time was when the Titanic made its deadly plunge beneath the icy water. By 2:40 a.m., Stone was certain the strange ship was gone. Stone then informed Lord that the ship had fully disappeared to the southwest. Lord, for one final time, asked about the rockets, and Stone assured him that there were no colors, just white rockets. Lord then told Stone to put it in the log. Stone and Gibson then resumed their watch until they saw another rocket streak in the air around 3:30 a.m. This rocket was off to the south, and further than the others had been. The ship then launched 2 more rockets, but it was below the horizon, so the 2 men could not actually see the ship. They noticed these rockets were company signals, and not the white rockets the other ship had fired earlier. Stone did not report these new rockets to the captain though. At 4 a.m., their shift was over, and Chief Officer George Stewart appeared on the bridge. Before relieving Stone, Stone described the night's events. The strange ship to the southwest, the 8 rockets fired, the ship slowly disappearing, and informing Captain Lord of these events 3 different times. As Stone talked, Stewart looked through his glasses to spot a 4-masted steamer with 1 funnel and a lot of lights amidships. He then asked Stone if this was the ship that he had seen fire the rockets earlier that morning. Stone replied that he had not seen this ship before and was positive that it was not the same one that had fired the 8 rockets. With that, Stone retired, leaving a perplexed Stewart on the bridge. Stewart had an uneasy feeling that something had happened. Rockets at sea usually meant distress, and Stewart couldn't help the feeling that may have been the case here. However, as uneasy as he felt, it wasn't until 4:30 a.m. that he did anything, and that was to awaken Captain Lord at his accustomed hour. He started to recount the night's events to Lord, but then about halfway through, Lord stopped Stewart and said he already knew all of this from stone. Once on the bridge, Lord started to describe how he would work his way through the ice field. Stewart asked if he was going to try and learn what happened to the other ship, but Lord looked at the new ship on the horizon and stated that she looked alright now and wasn't making any signals. Stewart did not explain to his captain the ship he was looking at now was not the one Stewart was referring to, and was not at all the ship that had fired the rockets. Over the next hour, the feeling of unease gnawed at Stewart, until he finally decided he needed to go down to the wireless room to get some information. He woke up Cecil Evans and asked him to find out if there was anything wrong with the ship that was firing off white rockets this morning. Evans got up and put on his headphones and began listening. Within minutes, Stewart was racing up the stairs to the bridge, shouting to Captain Lord that the ship they had seen the night before had sunk. It was the Titanic. Lord then fired up the engines to head to the Titanic's last known location. At 8:30 a.m., the Californian made it alongside the Carpathia, the first rescue ship to make it to the Titanic's aid. The Carpathia then continued on to bring the survivors to New York. The Californian then stuck around to look for survivors, but didn't have any luck. She then went to Boston, reaching port on April 19th. Rumors began almost immediately that the ship had been close enough to aid the doomed Titanic, and the captain and crew would be under intense scrutiny in the upcoming American and British investigations. The story the crew, the captain, and the logbook would tell is controversial to this day. After the initial shock of the Titanic disaster came a desire for answers. 2 different investigations would be launched, one American and one British. The American Senate subcommittee would focus on how the disaster occurred, while the British Board of Trade Inquiry would focus on why. Senator William Smith of Michigan would be leading the American effort. The hearing began on April 19th, the same day the Californian docked in Boston Harbor. Immediately after docking, newspapers seemed to grasp a potential huge story, that the Californian had been close enough to the Titanic to save her passengers and crew. Captain Lord assured them that his ship had been some 20 miles away from the Titanic on the fateful night, well beyond visible range. When asked about reports that some of the crew saw rocket flares that night, he brushed it off, saying sailors will say anything once ashore. However, one of the Californian's crew would not be easily quieted. Ernest Gill, one of the assistant engineers on Lord's ship, took a reporter and 4 fellow engineers to a notary public to swear out a lengthy affidavit, in which he maintained that he personally had seen a ship firing rockets just after midnight. As well, even more critically, he claimed the ship was no more than 10 miles away, and that he had heard Californian's second officer say that he too saw rockets and had told Captain Lord about it. The affidavit was printed in its entirety on April 23rd by the Boston American. After Senator Smith received a copy, he immediately sent marshals to Boston to serve key individuals like Lord subpoenas to appear on April 25th. Smith brought Gill to the stand and questioned him extensively on the affidavit, with a special emphasis on the rockets he saw. Gill concluded his testimony by saying he believed the ship they saw that night was the Titanic. Next up was Captain Lord. He maintained that he never saw the other ship, and that the ship his officers saw was simply too small to have been the Titanic. Instead, he claimed that some unknown ship stopped roughly 10 to 12 miles from the Californian at about 11:40 p.m., then steamed off at around 2:30 a.m. He believed that was the ship the Titanic crew had seen that night, positioned between the Titanic and the Californian. Why that ship sent up rockets, Captain Lord had no idea, but he was sure they weren't distress signals. After his testimony came Senator Smith's cross-examination. Smith drew attention to the fact that any reference to the California's officers seeing rockets had been omitted from the ship's log, and that the pages for the late evening of April 14th and the early morning of April 15th were missing from the scrap log. Little clarification here. A ship had 2 different logs. One informal, called the scrap log, where everything is written down, and then the formal log. In the scrap log, things like everything involved in the handling of the ship, signal and navigation information, and status of the crews and stores were written down. It also would have included any sightings of other ships. It is the captain's job to to review the contents of the scrap log and approve, amend, or correct entries, after which they are entered into the ship's formal log. The scrap log is kept as a backup and is rarely ever thrown out. Back to the cross-examination. Senator Smith also noticed it was only the late evening of April 14th and the early morning of April 15th that were missing from the scrap log. The rest was intact. He then examined Lord on the nature of rockets usually used as distress signals, which caused the captain to describe distress rockets in terms eerily close to the ones spotted by his officers that night, white without any colored stars. Smith then confirmed that Lord had seen the other ship steam up over the horizon at 11 p.m. and not 11:40 p.m. like he stated earlier. Smith also confirmed that Lord had been told 3 times that a ship nearby was firing white rockets, and that he hadn't even bothered to wake up his wireless operator. Smith went as far as to request the U.S. Navy's Hydrographic Office to supply the committee with all the information it had about ships in the vicinity of the Titanic's final position, and the Navy found there was nothing to indicate that there might have been another ship between the Californian and the Titanic. All of this is pretty damning in hindsight, but at that time, passenger liners were pretty lax with regulations. It wasn't even a requirement for round-the-clock wireless watching. What hurt the public perception of the Californian's captain and crew most was the way the captain of the Carpathia had quickly reacted to the Titanic situation and sprung into action, heading 58 miles to help, while the captain and crew of the Californian admitted to seeing some ship firing off white rockets without attempting to help in any way. When Lord presented the full results of his report on May 18, 1912, his verdict of Captain Lord's actions on April 14th and 15th were scathing. I am well aware from the testimony of the captain of the Californian that he diluted himself with the idea that there was a ship between the Titanic and the Californian. But there was no ship seen there at daybreak, and no intervening rockets were seen by anyone on the Titanic, although they were looking longingly for such a sign, and only saw the white light of the Californian. A ship could not have gone west without passing the Californian on the north or the Titanic on the south. The ice floe held but 2 ships, the Titanic and the Californian. The conduct of the captain of the Californian calls for drastic action by the government of England, and by the owners of that vessel, who were the same owners as those of the ill-fated ship. He had soundly condemned Captain Lord for failing to come to the aid of the Titanic. The next investigation would be by the British government. The Board of Trade Inquiry began its session on May 3, 1912. The lead would be taken by Lord Mersey. On May 14th, the intense interrogation of Captain Lord would begin. He was grilled by the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, on the points of his testimony. The story of the Californian had been as big of a sensation in Great Britain as it had been in the United States. Lord attempted to explain that he had not been told of a single rocket being fired, that he had not seen any of the rockets himself, that he was never informed by his officers that they thought the rockets might be a signal of a ship in distress, and that he had been asleep in the chart room at the time. These explanations were found to be inadequate by the examiners. It got worse for Lord when his officers contradicted him on nearly every point of his testimony. Most significant was the number of times Lord had been told about the rockets, and how many there were. Mersey also mentioned the suspicious lack of entries about the rockets in the Californian's formal log, in the disappearance of the scrap log pages from the evening of April 14th in the early morning hours of April 15th. The revelations kept coming. It was found that the reason none of the officers on the Californian tried too hard to push Lord to action was because of fear. In particular, fear of the captain's wrath. It came out that Captain Lord was a virtual tyrant, quick to disparaging remarks, and his officers were utterly broken by him. It had reached the point where none wanted to show any initiative, leaving all decisions to the captain. The image created in the mind of the public ever since has been of the Californian's officers standing idly by on the bridge, so thoroughly intimidated by their captain that they would rather watch another ship sink than run the risk of facing his temper. The findings of the Wreck Commission were delivered on June 30th, and once again, it was not pretty for Captain Lord. Lord Mersey made it crystal clear, in his opinion, the ship the Californian's officers saw from their bridge and watched fired rockets was the Titanic. Captain Lord's excuse that he was asleep in the chart room and couldn't recall having been told about the rockets did not make any sense to Lord Marcy. He believed Lord acted improperly in failing to ascertain what was the matter with that ship and go to the vessel's aid. He stated there are contradictions and inconsistencies in the story, as told by different witnesses. But the truth of the matter is plain. The Titanic collided with an iceberg at 11:40. The vessel that was seen by the Californian stopped at this time. The rockets sent up from the Titanic were distress signals. The Californian saw distress signals. The number sent up by the Titanic was about 8. The Californian saw 8. The time over which the rockets from the Titanic were sent up was from about 12:45 to 1:45 o'clock. It was about this time that the Californian saw the rockets. At 2:40, Mr. Stone called Lord that the ship from which he had seen the rockets had disappeared. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic had sunk. It was suggested that the rockets seen by the Californian were sent from some other ship, not the Titanic. But no other ship to fit this theory has ever been heard of. These circumstances convince me that the ship seen by the Californian was the Titanic. And if so, according to Captain Lord, the two vessels were about 5 miles apart at the time of the disaster. The evidence from the Titanic corroborates this estimate, and I am advised that the distance was probably greater, though no more than 8 to 10 miles. The ice by which the Californian was surrounded was loose ice extending for a distance of not more than 2 to 3 miles in the direction of the Titanic. The night was clear and the sea was smooth. When she first saw the rockets, the Californian could have pushed through the ice to the open water without any serious risk, and so would have been able to come to the assistance of the Titanic. Had she done so, she might have saved many, if not all the lives that were lost. At the end of the investigation, there were some who wanted an inquiry into Captain Lord's competency to continue as a master of a British ship, but nothing ever came of it. After the American and British investigations, Lord's career was effectively ruined. He became enough of an embarrassment that the Board of Trade asked him to resign. From there, the commands he was able to get continued to be smaller and slower. He repeatedly tried to request an inquiry with the Board of Trade in order to exonerate his character, but all were refused. He eventually died in 1962. His family continues to fight to have his character rehabilitated to this day. As for the ship that Lord commanded on that fateful night, the Californian, her fate was equally tragic. During World War I, she was brought under the control of the British government, even serving during the famous Gallipoli disaster. On November 9, 1915, her end was met, when she was torpedoed by German U-boats off the coast of Greece. Her wreck has never been found. The story of the Californian is still so controversial today that it's barely ever mentioned when talking about the story of the Titanic. In James Cameron's blockbuster, it is only included in a blink and you'll miss it reference. The defenders of Captain Lord use a variety of clever arguments, like Earth curvature, to prove that the Californian had no way of seeing the rockets or to be in a position to help the Titanic. Here are the main points on why the defense of Captain Lord has failed. The first huge issue is the rockets. The numbers seen by the officers on the Californian and said to be fired by the Titanic crew are identical. 8. All the rockets fired by the Titanic were white, and the times of the rocket launches by the Titanic crew are basically identical to the times reported by the Californian's officers. As well, no one on the Titanic saw rockets from any other ship that night, which destroys Lord's claim that some mystery ship was firing rockets between the two ships. Speaking of the mystery third ship, no vessel has ever been found that can be reasonably placed anywhere near both the Titanic and the Californian, in a position to where she could have been seen by both ships at the same time. The ship that is most energetically theorized to be that third ship is the Icelandic shipping smack Samson. In the 1930s, a typewritten manuscript based on a handwritten journal kept by one of her crew was discovered. It stated that Samson was in fact the vessel between the Titanic and the Californian, and the rockets seen were signal flares to communicate with other fishing vessels. However, this vessel being the mystery third ship is quickly debunked. The log of the customs collector in an Icelandic port, which shows when harbor fees are paid, so the ship has to be in port in order to pay them, puts the Samson there on April 12th and 20th, making it impossible for the little 6-knot fishing boat to have been able to leave Iceland, reach a point anywhere close to the Titanic, and then return again. The most critical argument in defense of Captain Lord is that the Californian was too far north to see the rockets or even to arrive in time to save the Titanic. Lord maintained that his ship was 21 miles away from the Titanic. which would have put the Californian over the horizon and out of sight. Even the rockets would have been hard to spot at that distance. It was this distance that allowed a third mystery ship to slip between the Titanic and the Californian, launch 8 rockets, then leave. Even if you discount the highly unlikely amount of coincidences needed for this story to occur, this argument still doesn't hold up. It has been conclusively found that the clock that 4th Officer Boxhall on the bridge of the Titanic was using to calculate the Titanic's position had not been reset at the beginning of the last watch, so it was running about 20 minutes fast. Using this incorrect time, he estimated that the Titanic had traveled 14 miles further west than she actually did. This meant instead of her position being 41.46 north by 50.14 west, she was actually at 41.43 north and 49.56 west, somewhat south and east of where Boxhall's figures placed her. And even if you take the Titanic's correct position, the Californian still would have been roughly 20 miles away. But the Californian's logged position was calculated by dead reckoning, based on sun sighting taken some 4 hours earlier. What that doesn't take into account is the 1.5 knot current from the north by northwest that caused the ship to drift south by southwest as she was steaming. A drift then continued after she stopped at the edge of the ice field, pushing the Californian nearly 9 miles away from her estimated position. Factoring in that drift, it puts the Californian less than 11 miles from the Titanic, clearly visible. Further evidence of the Californian's location can be found by wireless radio reports. On April 14th at 7:30 p.m., when Cyril Evans of the Californian relayed an ice warning, he gave their position as 43.3 north by 49.9 west. At this point, the ship was on a west by southwest course. However, when the Californian stopped 3 hours later, the position put into her official log was well north of where that course would have taken her, had she maintained that course. There is no indication that Captain Lord ever ordered a course change. And even if he had done so, it would have been to the south. Changing course to the north would have carried the Californian into heavier ice regions, much like how Captain Smith of the Titanic, when he got ice warnings, changed course further south. The official log in particular is sketchy. Like I said, the captain decided what is important enough to go into that from the scrap log. And the scrap log was missing for the key night of April 14th and the early morning of April 15th. It stands to reason that after finding out that the ship directly in eyesight of the Californian that appeared to be in distress had in fact sunk, that Captain Lord would have a vested interest in eliminating those scrap log pages and shaping the official log in a way that exonerated him. At the end of the day, the simple fact that damns Captain Lord and the crew of the Californian is that they did see a ship launching up white flares of distress and did not come to its aid. They never attempted a wireless radio contact and showed no sense of urgency that night to discover what was going on. For that, it is hard to make an argument that exonerates those on board the Californian that night. Even if they were unable to make it in time, they still could have at least tried. The question of if they could have saved all of the lives on the Titanic can never be known for sure, but what is known is that over 1,500 lives were lost that night, while a Californian watched from a distance.